Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Gazinski of Seyfarth Shaw and a college fellow since 2001. We're delighted to welcome you to what amounts to several firsts for the College of Labor and Employment Lawyers. Its first nationwide continuing education program. It's a series of these programs, which will soon include a discussion on EEOC developments with EEOC Commissioner Victoria Lipnick, and programs on virtual mediations, arbitrations, and court agency trials and hearings. As you know, the college has typically provided programming through each region corresponding to the jurisdiction of a federal circuit court. The Second Circuit Regional Planning Committee had the initial conception for what we're launching today. That conception has been developed and broadened nationwide through a task force spearheaded by Daryl Gay of Errant Fox. If you have actual experience practicing virtually in the other areas we'll soon cover, or have any other ideas for programming, please let us know. In developing this programming, we've recognized that there's already plenty of other programming available on essentially the same topics. So we've decided to leverage what the college represents to distinguish ourselves. We're very experienced practitioners who come from across the spectrum of representation angles, and we're pledged to set standards of professionalism and civility. This is programming by fellows for fellows. So we're looking to you to use the chat feature in the bottom right of the GoToWebinar right panel to ask questions and make comments throughout the program. I want to very briefly thank my firm, Seyfarth Shaw, for agreeing to co-sponsor this series of programs. Among other things, that means that Seyfarth is supporting CLE accreditation for these programs where available nationwide. Here's our specific plan for this webinar. For the next 30 minutes or so, Greg Casson, who serves as the Director of Operations Trial Technology at US Legal Support, will lead us through a demonstration of the technological and other logistical aspects of conducting depositions virtually. Greg has provided trial technology support and consulted on more than 100 trials and more than 600 depositions. Most recently, he coordinated remote participation for the first remote federal bench trial in the US and trains law firms on integration of remote platforms to successfully conduct depositions, arbitrations, and trials remotely. We will then turn to a pair of L&E litigators and college fellows with actual virtual deposition experience to share practical guidance on effectively navigating through virtual depositions, led first by Melissa Woods from the employee union perspective, and then by Doug Dexter from the management perspective. Melissa Woods is a partner in the New York City office of Cohen, Weiss, and Simon LLP, who specializes in litigating L&E matters on behalf of unions and individual employees. She also leads the firm's sexual harassment prevention practice. Previously, she provided advice and counsel on various L&E related issues at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the Civil Rights Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's Office, and another union-side labor law firm in NYC. Most recently, she was the Deputy Commissioner and General Counsel at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. After Melissa, we will go to Doug Dexter, who advises and defends employers with his team at Farella, Braun, and Martel in San Francisco. While Doug grew up in San Francisco, he began his practice in Southern California and has been sheltering the past few months with his family in Santa Barbara. He is currently serving as Vice Chair of the ABA Labor and Employment Law Section. So Melissa, I take it to you. Oh, I'm sorry, I take it to Greg first, of course.
Thank you, Lauren. And so today I'm going to talk about the remote deposition platform and how that can help you facilitate a deposition remotely as close as possible to an in-person deposition as you would like to get, showing you different features about it and also ways that you can make it go as smooth as possible with a few of these different settings here. And so the first thing we're going to get into is the audio. And I'm going to go over and play videos and pause them as we go and talk to you about each of the steps in these different parts of a deposition. The first being the audio settings. It's the first place you land when you get into the remote depo platform. It's a good place to start in that order. And so we'll start with the video here. And you land on this page when you get into a deposition in a remote setting. You have a couple options here. One is computer audio, and the other is the Call Me tab. We do recommend using the Call Me tab when you can, and that's phone audio combined with the computer rather than the computer audio. If you are using computer audio, we do recommend a headset if you do have one available, and that being a wired headset so you don't deal with battery issues during the deposition. So again, computer audio works okay, but it is recommended to use that Call Me tab. And with the Call Me tab, you just enter your phone number and then click Call Me, and it'll ring your phone. You pick up your phone, and you'll be connected into this meeting, and it will know that that video, your video matches that audio, so you won't get one of those phone icons and a video icon and every time you talk there. The next thing we go to is that option for computer audio. You can join by computer audio, and with that, say you join by computer audio, and you end up finding out that the internet, and the reason to join by phone audio is because if you have any lag in internet video, if you have that stable phone, the court reporter won't miss a beat and opposing counsel won't miss anything you're saying, and it won't slow down the deposition just because the video is a little lagging. If you do get breakup in internet connection and the video is connected to the computer audio, you could lose bits of that, and the court reporter will have to ask you or the witness to repeat things. So again, we recommend the phone audio. Next thing is the mute button. We do recommend muting anytime you're not speaking unless you're the attorney asking questions, the objecting attorney, because if the objecting attorney mutes and then tries to unmute to get the objection in, it's almost too late sometimes to not step on the answer. So we recommend the questioning attorney, the objecting attorney, and the witness to have their microphones unmuted. In addition to that, the reporter probably will too, because in case they need to jump in, if someone's talking too fast, they'll miss that beat as well. Everyone else should utilize this mute button during the deposition once the court reporter has all your information, but also on any breaks, anytime you step away from your computer, it's a good idea to do that. The next bit here is the up arrow next to the mute button. That's your audio settings. If you joined the meeting with computer audio and you find that it is lagging and you want to switch to the phone in the middle of the meeting, you can do that by clicking that switch to audio button, which is the third from the bottom. Once you do that, it brings up this tab where you could either dial in, which is the same as Call Me, it's just that you have to dial numbers, any choice of those phone numbers, the meeting ID, and then that participant ID. But we do recommend the Call Me tab as well. So that will pop up again there if you did need to switch audio. Same thing if you needed to switch from phone audio to computer audio because your phone was dying or it was getting a bad signal, you can always go to that up arrow next to the mute button and switch audio in the middle of the deposition. The next bit we want to go over are the different ways to view the witness and all the participants. So the first thing we'll get into is speaker view and how that can work with depositions without court reporters, but also, depositions without videographers, but also depositions with videographers. And so we'll jump into that video. And this is called spotlight view. Or this is called speaker view, and then we'll do a little bit of spotlighting. So we get into here, and the first thing you see is a particular person that's speaking, and every time they speak, it switches based on who's talking, and it bounces around. So in a deposition, you likely wouldn't want, if you did choose to use this view, you likely wouldn't want it to ping in every time there's an objection on opposing counsel when they're visible at the top. You want it locked on the witness like you're looking the witness in the eye. And so we'll play this here and go up to the little dots above Caroline's head. If you click on those And this is, as an attorney, you can click on this, or any of the participants can click the fifth one down there is pin video. I'm sorry, the fourth one down there is pin video. Now this will change Caroline on your screen only. Anytime somebody talks, it won't be bouncing around with objections. So she will be locked on your screen if she's the witness. Now for video depositions, the videographer controls this. We need to control it so that the video that you end with is only the witness and it doesn't ping around. So what we do is spotlight view. And so spotlight here you'll see change over to John if John was the witness. And no matter who's participating, if you're in speaker view, this big picture view, you will see John. So that just changed everybody's screens to only see John. If you don't want to stare at John all day, for example, if you're the witness, we'll get into gallery view later, which is similar to what people are calling the Brady Bunch view or the Hollywood Squares view. But this will be locked if you decide to go with video in order to end with a video product that can be synced with the transcript and is the witness only, as you would expect from an in-person video deposition. And we can do those in-person or those remote deposition recordings to include time and date stamp, as you would expect in an in-person deposition, and it can be synced with the transcript. So the next bit we want to get into here is another view and a few settings at the same time. But the next view is gallery view, which is that Brady Bunch view, and also some of the changes you can make to your computer in the remote depo platform that will stick for the next time when it comes to sharing exhibits, viewing witnesses, and optimizing the screen space that you have. And so we'll start with the video here. And so we start in that speaker view where it's locked. And if you go up to the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there's a gallery view button. You click that and you end up in that Brady Bunch or Hollywood Squares view. Now with that, you don't necessarily need to see a bunch of blank boxes for additional counsel, the court reporter, the videographer that have their screen turned off. And if you had, say, 10 people in here, it would start shrinking each video would be smaller and smaller because it was filled up with these blank boxes. And so a change you can make to your settings is clicking the dot on any of those videos or the 3 dots on any of those videos. And there's a drop down there, and you'll want to hide non-video participants. And so by doing that, if you had, for example, 12 or 50, it would eliminate all of the black squares and only have the ones that are turned on. Now, so you still know who's in the room, you can just look to the right at the participants tab on the right-hand side of the screen and see that Elizabeth Wells is still in the room, though you can't see her blank box video there. The next thing is when someone shares an exhibit with you, and that hide non-video participant sticks. Every meeting you come back into, it'll stick, and you can always undo it, and there's an option to do that. Now, when someone shares an exhibit with you, default settings are to have those little boxes on the right-hand side while they're sharing an exhibit. If you want to have those side-by-side and resizable with the exhibit, what you would do, and this seems like the default option that everybody has been preferring in these, is go up to the top and click View Options. And there's a drop down. And so this option would be called side-by-side mode. You select side-by-side mode, there will be a checkbox next to it. And every time you come back into a new meeting, you'll have this new view that we'll go through. And you can always revert that again if you need it later, but it will be your new default. And so now you see the videos are on the right and the exhibit is on the left. And then in the center there, we're going to grab and drag this box. You can resize the video so you can see more of the witness in bigger view. And important is combining the hide non-video participants with that side-by-side view. Otherwise, you would still have a bunch of little boxes filling up the space where my face is and where Caroline's face is. Now, when someone stops, stop. I'm sorry, Lauren? And when someone stops sharing.
But can you discuss for the participants the possibility to use multiple screens so that you don't have to be time back and forth?
Absolutely. Yep. So there is, and it's not shown here, but there in the preferences. I'll just describe this. In the bottom of your screen, where you would see the mute button that we had before with an up arrow, next to that there's an up arrow to the video button, and one of your options in there under General is dual monitor mode. And if you take dual monitor mode, the next time you come back into a meeting, for it to take effect, you would have to leave and come back. Next time you come back into a meeting, you can get video on the left and exhibits on the right. And you can have a foursquare, for example, of the report, for example, the witness, questioning counsel, and opposing counsel. And I guess it would just be 3 for a deposition. It would be 4 in an arbitration if you had an arbitrator on the screen. But so it's dual monitor mode.
Greg, can I just interrupt and suggest to everyone that for me, it's almost inconceivable trying to get through a deposition on either side of the table without having a second screen under these circumstances, to be able to see your documents and see the other people and the control panel on 2 separate screens, I think is crucial, and I really encourage people to prepare in that way.
You can also add real time, which we'll get into in a bit, on that screen as well, if that's something that you're interested in. For witnesses that don't have 2 monitors, this is the optimal, is this side-by-side mode. But anytime you can have 2 monitors is always best. And then we'll get into where you can add a tablet for real time if you needed that too. So the next thing, Lauren, we get to go on. I'll go on to the next one. And so the next thing we'll go into, and we'll go a little further with this. If someone stops sharing their screen, that's what you end up with. So it reverts to the side-by-side in gallery view, or it would be a foursquare if there were more folks in there. The next bit we'll go into is the participants window. So the participants window is along the right-hand side, and it helps for transparency, and there are a few other features that are great with that, and so we'll get into that. So at the very bottom of your screen, and while I'm at it, if you look at the bottom of your screen in the lower left-hand corner where it says Start Video, to the right of that Start Video, that's that up arrow that I was referring to switch into dual monitor mode. And you will have to change that in order to use the actual dual monitor mode within the platform. Having 2 screens alone won't change that or make the platform work on 2 screens. It's that button and that setting in there that adds to it, that makes video on the left and exhibits on the right. And so with this one, though, we'll go into the participants tab. So in the bottom center of the screen, there's a button for participants. And if you click that, it opens the panel on the right-hand side. This shows you everyone in the room, and everyone can see everyone in the room to make sure no one's in here that shouldn't be in here. To add to that, what you can do is, and we've done this in arbitrations and depositions, is rename yourself. And so if you go to the More tab, and click rename, it pops this box up here. And we've recommended that folks either rename whatever is agreed to, rename with your firm name or the party to the suit, or plaintiff and defendant, or whatever works best for you. But it helps you all know who's in the room, and it also helps the court reporter identify from the beginning who's in the room, along with the videographer or the tech. And so we click OK there, and Caroline is renamed with her firm name. Now the other feature that we have here is the waiting room feature. And we'll get into breakout rooms in a little bit, but waiting room is like limbo or being in space or being in the waiting room of a law office. And so you can put participants, for example, if counsel needed to talk without the parties or without the witness, you could put the witness in a waiting room. We can also set it up where everyone enters and sits in a waiting room before they're let in the meeting. It's an additional security feature to make sure no one, on top of the passwords and all the security that goes into making sure no one accidentally gets in this room, you could use this feature for different things. And so we'll put John in a waiting room here. And so And this can only be done by the host. The host would be the videographer. And so we'll go to the bottom there and go to put in waiting room. And John disappeared. And so this is the view that John has on his screen when he's in a waiting room, or anybody that's put in a waiting room. They can't talk to anybody. They can't hear you in the main room. They can't see you. And then we'll go back to the main screen. And they can be admitted by the host as needed. So again, videographer would handle this in a video deposition, or we would host an arbitration if you needed something like that. We could pop people in and out of waiting rooms as needed. And so we let John back in, and he's back in the room here. Now onto exhibits and the different ways you can share exhibits. We'll go through 3 different setups for sharing exhibits today. The chat window is the first one. And so I'll present my screen here for a video. So the chat at the bottom of your screen is set up where you can only message to the host or everyone. You can't message privately, and that's so you can't coach witnesses. It was kind of talked about early on in this remote environment that folks preferred it be turned off, so it is. Now, if you want to share exhibits through the chat feature, you can share anything up to 500 megabytes in size and any file type. And so one way is to click the file button and to browse your computer and click the file. Now here you would want to rename it the exhibit title. And then hit open. And that exhibit is now downloadable by the witness and all parties, including the court reporter, who would sticker the exhibit in post and provide it back to you, all the exhibits back to you with the transcript, with a sticker on it. So 2 ways to do this. The first one was to go to that file button. The other is to just drag and drop. And so dragging and dropping, and that exhibit is sent the same exact way. Now we'll look at it from the other side and see if someone sends you an exhibit, what you would go through. So the bottom exhibit there is an exhibit that someone sent to us. We could download that. So if you click download, you would save it to a folder on your desktop. And then you wouldn't need to go to that folder to open the exhibit during the deposition. Once it downloads, you can click open file right from the platform there and view the exhibit. And you'll see you have the full access to the exhibit that you can review at your own pace. So the witness can review the exhibit the second you drop it in there and let you know when they're done reading it. Again, any file size or any file type up to 500 megabytes in size. Now we'll get into the other way to share, and that is the share screen. And so the share screen can be used so you can direct the witness where to go. And they can also, we'll get into in a minute here, that they can do a little bit of direction themselves if you give them remote control. So we start by going to the share screen button at the bottom, and then choosing to share only an individual window. So we're choosing a PDF that's already open on the desktop. If you share your screen, the screen 1 or screen 2, and you minimize the document, they could see anything on your desktop, whether it's family photos or a PDF, an outline or a Word doc or anything else that you wouldn't want them to see that you had open, emails and things, including email notifications that pop in. And so we'll click to share an open PDF. And then you click share. And with this, you can annotate. So these annotation tools that we just opened are available to the witness and the attorney that's questioning. And the most common box here is the draw box. And within that, there are a few different tools that we'll show samples of. So there's a circle, an arrow, and probably the most common will be this highlight tool. Now those are not on the document, they're on the screen. So if you scroll, they move around. We'll get into permanent marking or permanent highlighting of exhibits through the native program tools, but these are in the remote platform. And so we can clear those drawings. And the next thing you could do is give the witness remote control. And so if you didn't drag and drop and you wanted to see what the witness was viewing at the exact time, they can click and scroll through the document. In addition to that, you or they can use the highlight tools that are built into Acrobat or Nuance or whatever you have, and those can be saved. And so if you save that as a new exhibit, you could drop it in marked up into the chat. And so we'll go ahead and take control back here. And the control is back to the attorney. Now they can only control this exhibit that we have open. If you wanted to use whiteboard feature, that is there, and that's under, so we went to the top there and went to new share. And once you have new share, you have this box, and you can either share a new exhibit or you can share the whiteboard, and we'll share that. And that has the same tools that you would expect from the previous sharing. Okay, so with the same share screen, you can use trial programs. Trial director is the most common. It helps pull focus to the witness. So if you're used to using trial presentation and deposition, you can use it remotely. And with that, the person that's handling this for you, whether they're from your office or they're from our office that has trial director, can do this completely remotely. And so they pull up an exhibit that you request, and then they highlight, or they'll start by calling it out as per your direction, call out the first 5 lines, and then center that on the screen. And if you talk about a specific portion, they can highlight that. In addition to that, you can share pictures. And do the same thing with arrows or circles or anything else. And lastly, videos. And so with videos, you can show if you have a discovery deposition, you're taking a trial deposition, you can you have those videos available. Also, animations or surveillance videos or anything else, any MPEG or synced video can be played in this platform. Now, the last exhibit program that we want to get into here is Instant Exhibit Plus, and this is online trial binders. They can be shared, it's a live repository, and they can be shared with all parties live during the deposition while having 24/7 access to a private folder to maintain your exhibits throughout the case. And so we'll go through a video there. And so this is what you would have here. Everyone would have their own internet window open. Now, this allows for files that are 5 gigabytes in size of any file type, unlimited files. And so here we have the case, and each firm would have their own private folder. That private folder, as I said, is accessible 24/7, and you can upload files into that you anticipate using during a deposition. And then the shared folder, the one below that, is where you would move those files live during the deposition and everyone can review them. This is great for cases that have 3 depositions a week for 2 years, or 1,000 exhibits and they're going to be used. The same 1,000 exhibits are always going to be called Exhibit 5 and Exhibit 7 and so forth, where they're not changing all the time. It works great in those cases. And so we have the private folder here, and we'll go into that using this tab here, but it's the same folder. And within that, we're going to click into the Caroline deposition, and we have these sample exhibits here. Now we're going to move these sample exhibits into the shared folder that we'll click on in a second here. And so this is the shared folder. And we're in the same deposition folder, but shared. And so again, private, you can only see, and your firm can see, and the people you assign can see it. And shared is for all parties to the case, including the witness. And so we're back into the private folder, and we're going to share an exhibit. So you would rename. And so that was called email from January, or from, let me see here, June 27th. And we're going to call that exhibit 1. Save that. And then to share it, we click the 3 dots to the right there and go to move or copy. And then within this, you just want to copy it to that shared folder. And all this can be done by a second share, or a paralegal, or us. We can have a tech do it. And so we're clicking into that shared folder to copy it. And clicking copy. And so now if we go to the shared deposition folder, and the shared deposition folder is empty, it's the place where the witness would be sitting all day and everyone else. And if they refresh their page once you introduce an exhibit, it's available to them. So they click on the exhibit, and now they can review it at their own pace. Very similar to dragging and dropping. It's just when you have many exhibits over, again, 3 depositions a week for the same case. This is a good way to do it because it also hosts your exhibits online, and the file size limitations are much larger. Okay, and so we'll get into real-time streaming next. So real-time streaming is the same as you would expect in an in-person deposition. And so we talked about multiple windows previously. Is if you have 2 screens, these are not attached to each other. These are separate windows, the video screen and the real time. You can move the real time to another screen. If you do have access to an iPad or a tablet, you can also go that route. And this will be the same as you would expect in an in-person deposition with real time that you would expect there, because it often goes through the internet in an in-person deposition anyways, so there won't be a difference, a noticeable difference there if you are used to using real time. And so you can scroll up and you can hit the play button, catch back up again. And you can resize the font, change the font color, and you can also mark up the exhibit here. So if we put marks on here, you can then go up to the top and cycle through those marks. And these marks can only be seen by you. No one else can see these if they're also getting real time. And so you can cycle through the marks there. And then you can also do a keyword search. And so if we type in a word at the top there, and we're cycling through the different words there. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about is the breakout rooms. Breakout rooms are great for private conversations, 15-minute breaks, and places to share exhibits where no one else can. The difference between a phone call on the side and this is being able to share the exhibits. And so we'll go through that quickly here. So if you want breakout rooms, you provide a list to the firm or to the court reporting firm, and we have that master list of who's allowed in your breakout room. We will not change or vary from that when people start entering the room. So if 5 people from the firm are allowed in and 1 person shows up and they're not on that list, we would check with all of those folks to make sure this person could be added on the fly. Otherwise, it's based off a list beforehand. And so you can rename these, or you can name your rooms by firm name, party name, or plaintiff defendant, and we'll name these 1 and 2. And this is all done by the tech that's on the job. So the tech from our firm would facilitate these breakout rooms and make sure that only the folks on the list are assigned and allowed in the rooms. And so we'll do a sample here where John and Travis are in room 1 and Caroline's in room 2. And then once we click open all rooms, everyone gets an invite, and this is the invite side of things. And when they see that invite, they should click later. If they click join, you'll automatically be ported in that room first thing in the morning, and you'll have to pop back in. If you click later, you'll have a new button, and you'll be able to come and go as you please. Now, if you accidentally click join, you just come back, you still have that option to come and go as you please. But if you click later, you'll stay in the main room in the beginning here. And then when you're ready to join a breakout room on a break, you click join the room. And so John and Travis are in this breakout room, and you'll see Caroline's not in there, and she wouldn't be able to see or hear anything they're saying, and they wouldn't be able to see or hear anything they're saying. And with that, you still do have the option to drag and drop exhibits, as I mentioned, and also share your screen and do all the other things. You can do it in the main room. Now, when you're ready to leave the room, you would just, in the lower right-hand corner, click Leave Breakout Room, and you'll want to return to the main session. So those are some of the basics that should get you through a remote deposition. And I'm going to stop sharing this trial director screen that I was sharing, and Lauren, and put the PowerPoint up.
I don't think I'm running the PowerPoint.
No, I got it. No, I'm going to put it up.
Okay, great.
I ran through trial director on my portion. Okay, can everyone see that?
You can.
Great, and just one last thing before we go to Melissa, kind of to echo what Doug said earlier. I don't always use live stream in depositions, but I sometimes do even when they're live. It seems to me that if you have enough screens and like an iPad or something, it's especially helpful to use it for virtual depositions, because you don't have to worry about the, breaking the eye contact and the interruption of the flow, and you have everything right in front of you in a very convenient way. So I've found it to be very helpful for virtual depositions. Now, Melissa, let's take it to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from my home office here in Brooklyn. We're going to talk today about how the mechanics of actually taking these remote depositions and things we need to be thinking about before we actually notice them, how we deal with our clients, and how we can probably maintain our own sanity during this time period. I'm going to go over some rules. And we have a series of slides that discuss some general rules we should think about, and some local rules that are going to be necessary for you to look into as you're thinking about taking these depositions remotely. So I'm going to start on this next slide, which is talking about getting the other side to agree to all remote depositions. Now, you might need a court order or a stipulation or some sort of specific language in the notice that you end up putting out. But at this point in our lives, in the, I believe, 5th month of our pandemic and many of us working at home, some of you may have already experienced this negotiation that you have to go through with the opposing counsel, and maybe even education with your clients about how these kinds of depositions are going to take place. But we're going to talk here about some of the state rules that differ, and just again, some thoughts as you go forward. The next slide, please. You know, federal rules say that we have to stipulate to, or you can stipulate to doing a remote deposition, and you should think about that. Again, the state rules are different. Places like Illinois and California, as you'll see when we go further, are not going to require consent to get this done, but your local rules are going to be really important as we think through this. Courts are clear that we need to be flexible to continue actually doing our business during this pandemic. And so you will see in a variety of states, they have put out either executive orders or some sort of notices. Many courts have sent folks who are admitted to practice in their jurisdictions notices talking about how the remote practice is going to be done in that jurisdiction. Next slide, please. Oftentimes you'll get to decide whether you want to do these remote depositions by telephone or video. I have heard folks doing them by Zoom or by Skype or by Blue Jeans, even FaceTime. There are lots of different ways to do it. And of course, Greg just gave us an understanding of how to actually sort of get it done and the bells and whistles that different programs have. And so you should certainly familiarize yourself with that, those sort of options that you have. Next slide. The model rules tell us that we need to be sort of amenable to our opposing counsel. And so we need to be thoughtful about what kind of notice we're giving, how we are sharing documentation, and if and when we're going to give pushback to doing deposition either by telephone or video. Next slide, please. Like many of you, I'm sure you've done remote depositions before. My first video deposition occurred in 2002. My local counsel in Tennessee had a family emergency and couldn't do a deposition, and so I ended up doing it from New York. As you can imagine, the technology was not so good back then, and we needed actually a team to do this. And one thing that we had to do is to have an assistant, I believe it was a secretary in the office in Tennessee, sitting in the room with the deponent to make sure that counsel was not coaching the witness. Now that we are all socially distancing and in our own homes, that's less of an issue. But it's again something to think about as you're planning your deposition. Next slide. An upside to doing these depositions is that we can keep our cases moving. The downside is that you're not in the same room with the client, and as Doug will talk about later, some of the issues being like not being able to make eye contact or understanding body language, or sort of having someone else who's assisting you in the practice in your physical space. So you need to think about your particular client and what those needs are, and then also your own hurdles with technology, if you have any. And so thinking through what kind of team support you need is always important, because you have to remember that this is going to be an exhibit. The intention is to use this later on at trial, and you need to be very thoughtful about what your evidence is going to look like and feel like to you, because courts have said that this is a fine way to be putting evidence onto the record. Next slide. So again, as we mentioned, the pandemic has made a lot of remote depositions and trials, for that matter. It's becoming a regular practice. It's, will be interesting to see if it maintains a regular practice after we all go back to work. Again, assuming that happens sometime in the near future. Next slide, please. The benefits are, you don't have to travel. You can set up your, paperwork and exhibits and things that you need in front of your computer. I personally don't have multiple screens at home, and I would submit that that's super helpful, but I do have a table in front of me, and I can have things spread out in the way that I need to. This practice, as Greg has described, is not terribly complicated in terms of technology, and it's something that can certainly be mastered. And if you need to, you can have a team of people helping you with the exhibits, identifying the breakout rooms, sort of manipulating the actual functionality of these depositions. Again, this is another place where you're going to want to look at the local rules to see what is required or not required in terms of who can operate the video, how the initial opening of the video gets taken, etc. So during this pandemic, and the longer it goes, we'll be more and more adept at doing this. Next slide. So as I mentioned, in the pandemic, people are getting on board and doing this well and fast. Sometimes you're going to need court orders, etc., to make it happen. As I talked about before, consent is sometimes necessary. Another one of my own war stories is I had an 8th Circuit argument scheduled for the week of 9/11. I lived in Manhattan at the time. My office was less than 10 blocks from the World Trade Center, so clearly I couldn't get to my office to get what I needed, but my opposing counsel was not willing to consent to adjourning the argument, and clearly back then we weren't even having a conversation about whether this is going to happen on telephone. Thankfully now we're not having those kinds of debates, but back to mentioning the model rules of professional conduct. At this juncture, if you're going to make an objection to taking a deposition remotely, I think you have to be really thoughtful about what the nature of that objection would be, because again, the courts are not interested in installing our procedures during this time. Next slide, please. So we are going to start talking, you can go to the next slide, about sort of why you might want to stipulate as opposed to just send a deposition notice and just sort of do that without consent. Again, you want to think about how this evidence is going to get used at trial, and you're going to want to think about that stipulation actually saying and expressly stating that you won't be able to object to taking a deposition by video. If you aren't able to stipulate to it or get that language into your notice, try to get it on the record before you start taking the deposition. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about some things to think about and some rules related to how you begin each deposition. You can move to the next slide, please. But again, these are things you should be thinking about in the very beginning. Here we have 2 templates for remote depositions. If you can zoom in on these, you'll see that there's no magic language in here. It's just establishing that the parties have decided to do the deposition remotely, how it's going to happen by video or telephone. And then again, you want to think about getting that language in regarding the objections that we're not going to be able to object to the manner in which the deposition is taken. Next slide, We have, so there was a federal version and there was a state version. Again, you're going to want to look at your local rules, but you can refer back to those 2 slides to help you think through what you want your stipulation to look like. Here we have some examples of cases and rules that talk about just the logistics. Again, you need to think about who is going to be responsible for the exhibits, getting them prepared and ready and entered into evidence, who is going to be responsible for taking the video. Ideally, the counsel who is actually asking the questions or objecting to the questions, well, I guess asking the questions would not be responsible for the video or the exhibits, just because there's sort of lots to do and there can be technological snafus, but you're going to want to look at the rules again. The federal rules don't prohibit a counsel from actually taking the video. But again, just check your local jurisdiction to see if there are any rules related to this, and then sort of how the video must be taken. There's some slides later on that talk about in some state jurisdictions, they have identified that, you know, if the video is a certain speed or other technical aspects of the actual video, you have to identify that later on. And so it might be something that you decide to outsource to either a company like Greg's or to your own IT people. Next slide. So here we're just talking about the kinds of information that might be required in the notice. And we saw this in the 2 samples we showed you a few seconds ago, that some jurisdictions require that you identify how the deposition is going to be taken and be specific about that. And when you're thinking about which local rules you have to look at, the federal rules identify that the deposition is going to be taking place where the deponent is sitting, so not necessarily where the counsel is sitting. Next slide, please. Most jurisdictions are going to require that you begin a deposition with a statement on the record identifying what's actually happening. You know, this is a deposition of so-and-so taken at this wonderful fancy place, hopefully, but in my case, it would be, you know, here in Brooklyn maybe, and setting the scene of who the court reporter is, what is their name, what is their address, what company do they work for. That kind of information has to be identified at the beginning of the video. You'll see in some jurisdictions, you not only have to do it in the beginning of the first video, but if there are subsequent tapes that you have to use, and that actually might be not the case in 2022 that we have actually a series of tapes, but I'm assuming if you do, then some jurisdictions are going to require that you do that beginning information about who the court reporter is, their name, their address, who their employer is, etc., at the beginning of each and every tape that you use. Next slide. And then, of course, it makes sense when you complete the deposition, a statement also can be required on the record by some jurisdictions that say, you know, again, who the court reporter is, that the length of the deposition, it's now over at such and such a time, and I submit that this is a complete and accurate version of the video deposition. Again, check your local rules, see where that's required, and if there's any specific language that you need to be including on that sign-off. If you're using a service, I am sure that they can also help direct you to those kinds of rules. Next slide, please. We can actually scroll through the next 4 slides just so folks can get a chance. Oh, can we do it a little slower? Sorry. just so folks can get a chance to look at them. But here we're really going into the specific rules of various jurisdictions. Does the video need to be sealed in an envelope? What if a party requests that a transcript be made? Who is required to pay for that transcript? How that kind of information is used? That's the rules that you're seeing in these next couple of pages. Let's see here. Let's just stop for a second so I can catch up with you. Some states, as you'll see in the Western District of New York, have rules regarding how the video gets taken. Now, some might say that this is sort of silly because, of course, we're going to be wanting to focus on the testimony that we're receiving. We want to make sure that the transcript is clear and accurate, that there's a good video of the deponent. But I think some of these rules are necessary. And again, I'm going to share a slight worse story and maybe even an interesting one. You know, probably 10 years ago, I was taking a video deposition of a witness in a case who was deemed to have, was not the actual decision maker, but maybe had some influence over the decision maker and was known to be very eccentric. And at some point during the deposition, he reaches into his bag and takes out a sausage that you would probably serve at a large party and begins to eat it. And later on, when we at the time we thought that was odd, but we just kept rolling with the deposition because we're professionals. But later on, when we viewed the transcript, we noticed that the person taking the video, which was a summer intern, had actually focused on the sausage. So there was a long period of time where you did not have the face of the deponent. So cautionary tale there, maybe be prepared for some strange behaviors, but know that the focus of the video should be on the deponent, making sure that their head and shoulders are shown so that we can actually see the information that's being recorded. Next slide, please. Many of these rules talk about the use of the testimony, and it's very similar to or virtually identical to your use of the testimony if you had a transcript. But it's important to look again at the local rules to see if there's anything specific that you have to do with a video. Again, here we have a rule from the Western District of New York that says that, you know, if there is an objection and to part of the video and it ends up getting sustained, you have to make a change to the video, you have to edit it out and then share that edited video with opposing counsel within a certain period of time. So you're going to want to know what those rules are and if you have to make those kind of changes and how to go about doing them. Also, it's important to think about what court you might be using this kind of information in and what kind of technology that they have to ensure that if you decide to use this kind of information in court, it's going to be something that's compatible and probably easy. So again, lots of things to think about in advance of taking the deposition. Let's now continue to scroll through till we get to Virginia, which is I. And go slow a little bit though, because we have this extra information in there about different states. We had DC, now moving on to Virginia. We'll get to California in a minute. And again, this is just showing that there's some nuances that each jurisdiction that you should be thoughtful of. Virginia is a state requiring that the deposition begin with a statement on the video, giving the logistics of who's taking the deposition, where you are, etc. Identifying every person who is present on the video camera. Those kinds of rules, again, things to think about. let's move forward here. Virginia is a place that also says or has specific rules about whether it needs to be authenticated. If you don't have a transcript, you may not need to have the witness sort of sign and date and review the deposition. So you're going to want to look at that. If the deposition is reviewed, and you can skip to the next slide. If the deposition, maybe the slide after that, is reviewed, then and changes were made, you have to identify not only the change, but the reason for the change. And then you have to sign and date after you've done so. If the witness refuses to sign and date, it might mean that the deposition will not be allowed into evidence. These are things that you, again, should think about. Let's go to the next slide. Then the next one. Again, here we're talking about just some specific rules to Virginia. Many of them may overlap with other states. Let's go to the next slide. And then the next, which I believe takes us to Maryland. Maryland is a place that has specific rules for adjourning or postponing a deposition, or even continuing when the deposition is taken by video. And so you're going to want to look at those specific rules and be very familiar with them before you begin taking the deposition. Let's move forward again, please, to the next slide. And then another one. And another one. So you'll see as we're traveling through these different states, many of them have very, very similar requirements. So in terms of our rules and regulations regarding how these depositions get taken, it should not be a heavy lift to understand what the differences are. Let's go to the next slide. Maryland is also a place that is very specific about the date and timestamp on the video. And so again, you're going to want to make sure before starting the deposition that your technology that you're using has the ability to do the hour and the minute and the second, which is required in Maryland. Let's skip again, please. And the next slide. And then the next slide takes us to California. And in California, they have specific rules about who can participate and when you have to give notice of who's going to participate in your deposition. A transcript is required in California, things that you should think about before you start taking your deposition. Next slide, please. You know, like I said before, often the rules are very similar to those if they were sort of a regular deposition or a normal deposition. You would do it when we're all in the same conference room and there's a stenographer. Here, California has some rules about entering the transcript into evidence if you're going to use it at trial, and how that should happen. Again, local rules are very, very important as you're looking at this practice. Let's go to the next slide, please. And the next slide, if you could scroll a little slowly, but take us to Illinois. We're going to see, again, that Illinois has some rules and regulations that need to be followed that look very similar to the other states, where we have this list again of what kind of information needs to be identified as the video deposition begins. Next slide, please. And then the next one. There is some language, next slide again. about how to swear in witnesses. And so here we have a link to a resource that you can use to figure out where states have made some changes to the requirements for what the swearing in looks like and how it can happen. Next slide, please. I think in many regards, it's going to be sort of self-evident that we're going to want to have a swearing in on the record. And we're going to want to make sure that that's very clear and established to make sure that there are no later objections to sort of how the deposition took place. And we're going to be able to use this kind of information at trial if we need to. Next slide. Every state's different in terms of their rules, and let's go to the next slide. And keep scrolling a little bit till we get to DC. In DC, you'll see that court reporters aren't permitted to administer the oath remotely, so that's for any of you practicing in DC, probably a little bit of a hurdle to getting this done, but remember that the oath is a very important practice, and so it might be something that you want to stipulate to or figure out some way to ensure that there's an acknowledgement of the oath prior to the deposition being taken. If you can switch to the next two slides, go to Virginia and Maryland. Again, not much different here, but there are, again, things that you need to think about in terms of what you need to do to make sure that you are crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's and taking these remote depositions so that you can then use the good deposition testimony that you're going to get at trial or in other maybe even dispositive motions. Next slide, please. Doug, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Yeah, a lot of different rules out there, of course, but well, I guess the way I would get started, if we start with our next slide, is that maybe appropriately for a discussion among the college fellows, cooperation is everything in this forum. If any of you have just tried to get involved in a Zoom meeting, you know how complicated it is getting a bunch of people who want to be there to cooperate with each other and to get online and make sure that all the technical bases are covered. And it's almost inconceivable to me to how one would force someone to participate, even through court order, in a productive remote deposition. Because as indicated in the first bullet point, to get started in this process, everyone has to be up to speed on how to even get online and use whatever particular remote deposition tool is being used by the particular court reporter service. And the process that you just walked through with U.S. Legal, of course, is at one of the higher functional processes. But of course, we only select the court reporter when we take the deposition, and so there are going to be some reporters have multiple systems that you can choose from that are Zoom based or webinar, WebEx based, and so on and so forth. So the point being, there's going to be investment on all sides ahead of showing up for the deposition. And my advice to anybody who's noticing a deposition is it's crucial that you make sure that everyone has already made that investment before you show up at 9:30, 10 a.m. on the day of the deposition. Otherwise, you're not getting, if you're lucky, you'll get started half an hour to an hour later. That brings us to the equipment. If there's one process that's emphasized to me, the digital divide and the wide variety of internet speeds and devices available to each individual around the country in their homes, it's this process. you need to understand, not only for your own client and for yourself, but for the person who is going to be on the other end, and particularly for the deponent, if you're taking the deposition, what devices they're going to be using, what they're feel ensured that their internet speed is going to be adequate. And on the slides there's a reference to what the recommended internet speeds are, and a test system for checking to see whether any of our home internet systems have those adequate speeds. Understanding, are you going to use the phone audio, as Greg suggested earlier in the program? My personal preference is to do as I'm doing now, be on the computer, but you got to make sure the rest of your household isn't playing video games or something, so that you're gonna not get tripped up on your internet speed, because that delay that Greg referenced in the phone audio, I mean, for a lot of us, timing is everything in a deposition, and having the opportunity to jump in when you want to jump in a timely fashion is part of the process. In this short time of COVID, we've shipped hardware. We've had court reporter services ship hardware to plaintiffs so that they had a laptop that everyone knew was going to be reliable. Ultimately, I've also so far, and maybe some of you out there have as well, experienced some hybrid of this, where the person being deposed appears at the court reporter's office, but is only there alone, or is there with their counsel, and everyone else is remote. And that way we know that the hardware that's necessary to get this done reasonably efficiently, excuse me, is in place, at least on that end of the process. Can we move to the next slide, please? Exhibits. In addition to, in my limited experience so far, in addition to the video and the streaming and so on, there is the manipulation, which I mean, of course, in only the best way, of exhibits. Getting them up on screen. Again, when we have a group of highly trained individuals doing that with good internet connection, it works fairly smoothly, but we can all assume that things will be more complicated. And so, as with so many other things, my outlook is we got to recognize that we're not in the old days, and there's going to be sacrifices involved in moving this ball forward. And if in fact we want these depositions to happen, considering, which may have been an anathema 6 months ago, consider shipping hard copies or sending hard copies, hard as in a PDF, to your opposing counsel so they can print and ship to their client, or shipping directly to the client. Hard copies of documents, with the recognition that you're sacrificing some element of surprise for some level of certainty and efficiency that we're going to get through the documents. The internet system often works fine, but there are so many unforeseeable glitches and technological barriers that can come up, that I've gotten to the point where I wonder sometimes about the trade-off. In terms of putting your exhibits on the system for remote access, I'm leaning these towards grouping exhibits together so that there are fewer to be introduced, and they can just be scrolled through, as opposed to having to reach out and pull up a new file, another file on the internet. And I think that's more efficient oftentimes than all multiple little files. if you're going to load up files and you do want to save your element of surprise, of course, the file names are visible on the system shared by everyone. So if you may want to avoid telegraphing with obvious file names. You also want to be ready if you're taking the defense, you're defending the deposition, to be able to download files somewhere of exhibits, and practicing all of that, of course, before you get started makes us all feel more secure. Next slide, please. As with a technological trial, you may consider having someone else there to move the exhibits along while you're concentrating on taking the deposition. And I'll just as an aside mention that I think one of the advantages of the remote deposition era, if you will, is that you can have more than one attorney or participant from your office or your client or whomever watch the deposition, of course, much more easily than when we were doing this in person. So there's a lot of options there, a lot of advantages in terms of both everybody knowing what's going on, and even in terms of training other lawyers to take depositions. So there's some opportunity there in terms of having more people present in the deposition remotely. In terms of going back to the exhibits, recognize that if you're going to use some file system, some type of file other than a PDF, that if it's going to be opened in other computers, then of course the software needs to be there to do that. So the alternative to that, again, is knowing in advance, are we using a system where I'm going to use a share screen as was done here, or is everyone just going to download files and pull them up themselves and so that they can manipulate themselves, right? Because the trade-off there is if you're using a share screen, then for the most part only you can flip pages and so on. If you are using documents that are or files that are in some unique from some unique program, considering converting them to PDF rather than as we've come to know them as in e-discovery native format, right? Okay, should we move on to looking good on camera? Make sure you know which camera you're looking into, just like you were, doing the television news. You feel more doing these depositions. You start feeling a little bit like Wolf Blitzer, but make sure you know where you're looking, and when you're muted and not, right? The recommendation is I've got a camera on top of a screen that's almost at eye level, just a tiny bit above me. As soon as COVID hit, I got an external camera to put on top of my screen, and I've been really glad that I did that. I also got this green screen which is behind me, which today happens to be green because GoToWebinar doesn't provide for backgrounds, but there, in Zoom you can do that. But either way, I prefer not to. Melissa's quadrant there is absolutely perfect. Mine is not behind this green screen, so I keep the private and keep the green screen back there. You can order one there. It's not a big technological or financial investment. You can order one on Amazon for less than $100, and I've been very grateful to have done that. Make sure that your head is in the right is centered if you want to present. At this point, I think most of us in the Zoom era recognize that backlight can be real rough on your image on a webcam. So staying away from windows behind you and so on. To state the obvious. Next slide. You know, try to avoid try to stay contrasted from your background so you don't have the sort of the floating head thing going on there. There's some best practices links there. Why don't we move on to the next screen?
And Doug,
yes.
Doug, can I just jump in for a minute? I want to share with everybody the CLE code because we're only about 6 minutes away from our scheduled end time. This CLE code for remote CLE is SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 8781. That's SS 8781. Sorry to interrupt, Doug.
No worries.
And also let me say, if Melissa and Doug, can you stay a few minutes extra to answer some questions, given that we're kind of going right up to the edge of time here?
Of
Sure.
course.
Great.
So, and speaking of questions, at this point, I think most of us are not too shy about asking uncomfortable questions in a deposition. And so the new questions, to start a deposition have to do with what's your environment like? Who's there? Do you have anything in front of you? You could even ask them to spin their camera around and so on. But we need to be confident that there aren't, do you have any chat functions open? When you prep with the court reporter, making sure that there isn't a chat function that's running back and forth freely between the deponent and their witness, because as I think was mentioned, breakout rooms are the way to deal with those private conversations. It's really strongly urged that, if you're going to be attending a deposition, either as a taking or defending lawyer, to ensure that there's a breakout room reserved apart from the deposition for you and your client to consult. So why don't we jump over to, in the last few minutes, why don't we jump over to the last two slides, witness control. Tantalating topic. Look, I think a lot of the things that cause a lot of us experienced lawyers to be concerned, other than these technological barriers and newness, to be concerned about depositions remotely is that it detracts from what we've been accustomed to as to how we go about making sure that a deposition is, under control. We have to recognize that we're going to lose some of the communication that is nonverbal, that is so crucial to how experienced lawyers, manage a deposition. When it comes to taking that deposition, my experience so far is it probably means being more document-led in the deposition process, right? Because there's just kind of this psychological detachment from the witness, in my perception, that isn't quite there when we're straight across the table from each other. There's also an exhaustion factor. You just have to recognize that people's concentration levels are, it's different. And trying to do a full day by video conference and keep everybody's intensity and concentration up is going to be super challenging. And the other challenge is there's just going to be inefficiency in this process, and you have to. I just encourage us all to be prepared for that. The documents, the going in and out of breaks, all of it is just going to be less efficient. But this is the world that we're living with. And the final slide on defending the deposition, right? Not only do we have taking depositions, but we have preparing witnesses remotely now, which again involves more challenges in sustaining someone's attention for that time period that we like to be able to reserve in order to get somebody prepared for deposition. So more than ever, I'd really encourage planning for multiple sessions, perhaps of shorter duration, trying to use the same platform that at least is similar to the platform that that you're going to be using that's going to be used in the deposition. Trying to figure out how you're going to efficiently go through documents, and discussing, what is your background going to look? How are you going to dress? Are you going to be stressed out by the being at home and having other things happening? How can we address that? And then during the deposition, you actually have more access to what the video looks like than you did in the in-person day. So take advantage of that opportunity. Make sure your witness is using a gallery view so they can see you, in addition to seeing the taking attorney. It's a lot more difficult to avoid your witness rushing and responding to questions before you can make your objections. So for one, don't mute yourself because by the time you unmute, a lot of stuff can happen. And number two, my advice is, don't be hesitant to admonish your client orally, because you don't have those nonverbal communications available to you. And to say, hey, witness, client, I just want to remind you, please don't speculate, please pause, all those kinds of things that we kind of try to figure out how much to say, and then maybe wish we had said it about 2 minutes earlier. In these circumstances, I'd really encourage and prepare your client for the idea that your primary way of communicating is going to be oral. So you're going to have to admonish them orally, remember what the rules are, remember how we prepared, remember to do this, remember not to do that. And with that, 1 minute over the line, I'll hand it back over to Lauren.
Thanks, Doug and Melissa. One quick point is that off of what Doug said about allowing more people to potentially watch, listen in for training or for substantive purposes. I think that's very valid. But obviously, going back to Melissa's points about the rules, you need to let people know that you're doing that. It can't be a surreptitious participation. And quick question for both of you. Do you think that it's an advantage, kind of content neutral, or a disadvantage to have this be the platform in which you're questioning a deponent?
Melissa?
Yeah, I think it's a disadvantage. I like having the nonverbal cues. I like being able to in discussion with a witness and opposing counsel, between questioning.
Yeah, and part of the issue is we spent a lot of years figuring out how to do deposition, and we like to think we're fairly good at it. Way to do it, figure out how to do it in a way that's most advantageous. But regardless, the lack of communication, lack of that opportunity, as Melissa said, to go out in the hallway, the inefficiency and trying to get documents out. It's a challenge, but the world that we live in right now, and
yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think that ultimately there was an article in today's Law 360 from somebody who did a virtual trial who said she thought it was actually an advantage to be able to cross-examine remotely because the witnesses seemed more apt to go on and less kind of careful and circumspect in their answers. But I think it's ultimately very circumstance specific and preparation specific and witness specific. But we need to be mindful of those things. We had a question remotely from a participant about the power to insist on live for a deposition. And the questioner specifically was interested about where it's defending, and there's concern about being able to adequately prepare the deponent because there's difficulty based on accessibility to broadband and a private computer and everything to being able to review documents. And I know that, like, I'd read a case in the Eastern District of New York where a former King and Spalding attorney was trying to get live depositions, and the judge said right now, no, we're not going to insist on live. We must go forward virtually. Do either of you want to comment on what you've been seeing and where you think this is going to head?
I haven't yet had a court battle over this. You know, as I said, I think it's rough to try to do this involuntarily. It's been through a mutual desire to bring this forward, where we're doing the depositions. I have to say though, I mean, if we continue as we're going into the rest of the year, I'd be obviously different judges are going to have different comfort levels. But I will say in California, the rule still is both parties have to stipulate that the court reporter is not in the same room as the witness. But all that said, you know, it may be difficult, increasingly difficult to argue to a judge that there are not resources available in one way or the other for a witness to be prepared via the internet.
I have a case right now where there are actually 3 parties, and one party has decided that they really don't want to go forward because they're concerned about their witness and they want to be able to be in the same room. For my client, we're okay putting it off for a while. We're not sort of looking to move this case forward very quickly. I think though, once the judge sort of wakes up and sees that nothing has happened for 5 months, we all might be getting our wrists slapped. But that, for us at least, that's a risk we're willing to take.
Thanks. And both of you exemplify this. The fellows are about civility and professionalism, but you did both allude during your presentations to the fact that not everybody that is our opposing counsel adheres to the same standards necessarily. Using the sausage you referenced, Melissa, is just one example. And Doug, you were mentioning, you know, things about like the care in the camera pans and things like that. Is there anything else that, very briefly, that hasn't yet been discussed that you think it would be worthwhile to discuss about how to kind of prepare for, in this new environment, for taking depositions for the possibility of that very difficult opposing counsel?
You know, I think for me, there's only so much control we can have. I mean, you can say, look, this is out of control and I want opposing counsel on video too, or something like that. That's going to be a pretty challenging thing to throw down, though. I think at some point, you know, watching eye contact and asking witnesses to tell us what they're looking at is really all one can do. Again, I want to emphasize, I mean, I think it is real important that we clarify that the chat is not going to be available. In fact, there's a record of the chat, but the chat's not going to be available on the system, at least, for between the deponent and their counsel. But, you know, we've got a lot of limitations. Melissa?
Yeah, I would agree, despite the fact that I like control and I like folks listening to my directives and following them. You know, there's just, you know, very little control that we have. And, you know, in like the days when we were kids and their biggest concern was people writing the answers on their arm. There are just too many sort of devices that people can be using to provide information or to be, you know, chatting in some other way than the recorded chat on the function. And you just got to be adaptable. And maybe this is a place where you also think in advance of going into the deposition of, you know, trying your best to create some relationship with opposing counsel such that you can minimize some of these problems down the road, which a lot have to, they focus on trust. So to the extent you can, you do, and to the extent you can't, you take a lot of deep breaths.
And the experts on video conferencing talk about the way the mind works with something they call prediction error, meaning that when, you know, a lot of communication actually is nonverbal when we're in person, and you get some of that nonverbal in a video conference, but delays, freezing, out of syncness, and then not being able to make clear eye contact, for example, can lead to the human mind wondering, what am I missing, and potentially overly compensating for what they think is being telegraphed when in fact they're not getting an accurate read. From your view as practitioners, and this largely relates to when you're questioning, do you have any specific strategies to help you be mindful of your potential for prediction error and to correct for it?
My response to that is experience, right? All we can do is, I mean, to me, you got to dive in and start becoming an expert at doing these depots. And that includes, as I mentioned, I mean, not only taking them, but watching your colleagues take them at your home office and see how it's going and start becoming acclimated to this process in this environment, just like we did when we were, you know, pop lawyers and getting started.
Yeah, and you know, I would add into that, to the extent that technology is not your thing, and it's difficult to focus on that and focus on the questioning and the deposition, I would outsource all of those sort of extraneous responsibilities to someone else so that you can really focus and listen to the questions so that you can have the adequate follow-up.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think that's a very important thing. Just like if you were at trial, as I said before, just like you were at trial and you had somebody there to deal with a lot of the technical stuff.
Great. Well, I think I'll give each of you, if anybody wants to add any last words. Okay, well, I really, Greg, Melissa, Doug, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for participating.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
everyone.
Much, Lauren. All right.
Someone's downstairs. Yeah.